Thanks, Sarah. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. So Sarah's already introduced me, so I'm going to go ahead and just start sharing my screen straight away. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off by showing you a little bit about what we're going to talk about today. So I've got a few slides to run through, and then we'll dive into some demonstrations. So firstly, I just want to talk a little bit about Microsoft Teams. I'm sure most of you are familiar with it, but just some key stats and useful things. So the latest stat I could find was from July 2021, where Microsoft announced that there are 250 million active Teams users every day, which is quite a lot. I mean, obviously some of that's been fueled by the pandemic, but also I think Teams has become essential to very much everything we do day to day. It's very much how we talk, how we chat, and how we collaborate. It's how we work together, whether that's remotely or as we return to the office and actually collaborate in those hybrid scenarios as well. And apps are very much part of that scenario. It's how we add more on top of the chat and the file elements within Team. They enhance that collaboration. It's how we work together on similar things. But there are a few gaps, and that's where I think the QuizCom apps sit really nicely. So we're going to focus mainly on two of the QuizCom apps today and how they can be used to get more out of Microsoft Teams. So the first one is Conforms, and it's worth saying, although we are focusing on Teams today, both of these apps work in SharePoint as well. So it allows us to enhance a SharePoint list to provide our own advanced capabilities, such as changing the form layout, cascading fields, repeating rows. And this is a fully responsive app. So again, whilst we're working primarily in Teams today, it does work in the browser, it does work on mobile devices. And then we're also going to be talking about the data view tools. So what's basically data view plus, but then there's a series of apps which make this up for working with lists or organizational data in terms of an organization chart, pictures, aggregation of data, and calendar, and how we can take data from all these different data sources and very easily and quickly display them in Microsoft Teams. As Sarah said in her introduction, all of these apps are very much designed for non-technical end users. You don't need to know how to write custom code. You don't need to understand complex logic, which you might do with, say, something like Power Apps. You can configure all of these apps inside a few minutes. You don't need to install a separate application, work in a different interface. And whilst there isn't any need for custom coding, there is scope for custom coding if you do have development resources, but we're not going to touch on that much today. So I've picked out 4 things I wanted to show you with these apps, which I think neatly show some of their capability in Microsoft Teams. So the first one is around enhancing SharePoint lists, how we can aggregate data from either a single SharePoint list, multiple SharePoint lists, look at different SharePoint lists, which don't necessarily have to be the same SharePoint site as our team, and then how we can customize the presentation of that data to make it immediately relevant and useful to users inside of Teams. So we're going to add things like filters, groups, conditional formatting, show some of the different styles we can work with as well as different data sources. We're going to look at how we lay out forms with things like different columns, layouts, introducing conditional logic, cascading lookups, so that idea of selecting a value and then filtering the next column. And then we're going to also look at multi-row forms. Calendars. It's something I get asked a lot when working with Teams. People are used to working with calendars, but actually Teams doesn't really have a great native way of displaying calendar. So with the Calendar Plus app, we're going to show you how we can display and easily present calendars inside of Teams from a variety of different data sources, including Exchange and SharePoint. And we'll look at how we can do some layout and formatting options around those calendars. And then finally, perhaps my favorite of the apps, the org chart. So how we can consume organizational data, often typically from Active Directory, but equally it could come from Excel or SharePoint if we don't have that organizational information, and how we can present that in various rich interfaces directly inside of Teams. So a lot to get through today. So let's dive straight into our demos. So I'm going to open up the browser here. So I'm working inside of Teams in the browser, and that's just because I'm in my demo tenant. So this will work whether you're in Teams in the browser, which I know some people use, or the Teams desktop app or mobile app. So I'm inside of Teams here, and we're going to start first of all by looking at a SharePoint list. Now let's firstly just show you my list itself. So I've got a list here which has got some suppliers in it. So it's pretty simple: name of supplier, supplier type, their status, when a review date is, and we're storing a country and a city against them. So fairly standard, and we could just put that list into Teams if we wanted to, and get some of the nice capability Microsoft make you available now with lists inside of Teams. But actually, I want to present that slightly nicer. I want to give my users a better interface, or maybe I just want to build for my users because I'm an end user managing my specific team. So I've got a tab here added to my channel called Suppliers. And in there, you see I've got that list, that suppliers list, but I've got some richer customizations done to it. So I've got groups, which I can expand and collapse. Notice they've got counts against them. So that's based on my supplier type. I've got some filters at the top here. So I can come in and say, well, actually, I'd like to either type in a search for a city, or I can actually just click here and select a specific city. So I could say, well, I'm actually only interested in suppliers from London. Thing I like here is we've got the option to select multiple, or even do everything but London. So options to build up multiple filters. I can save those filters. I can search more generally. And I've also got export options here. So if I want to export those rows out, I can do as well. I've also got various actions I can perform here, such as viewing the item properties. I can do things like email. Other actions include things like mapping or sending an email. So I've got different options dependent on what I want to do here. And this is all configurable. So the best way to show you this is actually to create it. And I'm actually going to create it again, just so that you can see it. So I'm going and adding a tab, and the Data View Plus app is already installed inside of Teams. So I'm going to go and add that tab. And it's there. Now I need to start the configuration. So the first thing it's going to ask me is to come and configure my data source. So I'm going to keep it fairly simple for the data today. So I'm going to say, I'm going to just create my data source a name called suppliers, and then look at the range of data sources I can connect to. So I can connect to an Excel file if I've got it in SharePoint with all those formatting options. I can connect to the Graph API, and we'll talk a bit more about that later. I can connect to the SharePoint user profile store, a single SharePoint list, an aggregation of SharePoint lists. I'll show you an example using tasks with that later on, or connect to information in SharePoint search. So let's pick SharePoint list. Now notice immediately I have it defaults to my current site, but I can select other sites. So I'm not restricted to just displaying it in the site associated to my team. Often the site I'm using for my team has limited amounts of data in, and it might be my lists are stored somewhere else. In this case it is, so I'm going to come in here and I'm going to select my suppliers list. I can do things like filter based on views, and depending on the data source type, there might be certain column mappings I need to do with more complex data sources. I can also manage multiple different data sources here, color code them up, or manage them into display groups. I'm going to keep it pretty simple for what I'm doing today, so I'm just going to work with that single data source. So that's configured, and now I can start to work with my data. And you'll see it's broken it down into these series of controls. And that's because it's got this sort of Lego style builder to the app. And in there, I can go in and I can start to customize it to my specific needs. And each of these controls, as they're called, will have settings against them. So I can go and set things like the title. I can go and configure options about my menu bar, what actions are available, what actions are not available. But this is quite a limited set of controls. This is what's called the basic mode. It's the basic setup for me to start working with it. It gets me started straight away. It picks me obvious options, but it's very quick and easy for me to switch to advanced mode and then start to make some changes around it. So once I've switched to this advanced mode, each of these controls gives me quite a lot more options. So firstly, I've got this list mode, but I'm not that happy with it. So I'm going to switch to the table format. So that looks a little bit more list-like. And then I can start to say, well, actually, what columns do I want in here? It's put all of them in there, but I can actually go in and pick my own ones. So I could say, actually, I want supplier name, I want city, I want status, let's say. And that will probably do me. I don't think there's any other columns I want here particularly. No, that's totally fine. Fantastic. And I can also go and define these different item actions as well. So what is available. And these are configurable, and I can define different settings about them. And QuizCom make a number of predefined actions available. So very easy and quick to customize those. Okay, so that's my table added. Now I want to do some other things. So I'd quite like that sort of tabbed interface, which I showed you before. That's really easy to do because I've got this builder type option here. So I can come in and add other options. So I can come in and add groups. And it immediately sets it up in a certain way for me, but I again can very quickly make changes to it. So I can just define I can come in and say, well, what am I grouping it by? So in this case, I want to group it by supplier type, yeah? And there's other options I've got here to customize the behavior. So do I want it expanded or collapsed by default? I can configure those options. What other options have I got here? So I've got the ability to add things like paging. I could add tabs instead of my groups. So if I didn't want it expanding and collapsing out, I could do tabs instead. That's quite nice. And I can also add filters. So when I add a filter, by default, it will just add that search field, and I can remove it if I want to. So under the settings, I can say, well, actually, I don't want free text search. And I can come in and I can define other things I would like people to filter on. So I'd quite like people to filter on city, and I'd quite like people to be able to filter on status. Yeah. I can even pre-bake filters in here. So if I want the app to be pre-filtered when users come to it, I can pre-filter those and have them pre-saved, and then they build on top of those filters. There are many other things which we can work with here, including things like conditional formatting, and I'll show you that in another example in a second. So that's got my app configured, and it's ready to use, and I can now just start using it just like I did the other option, and I can continue and go and customizing it using that sort of Lego style builder user interface. Let's go and show you a couple of other examples before we move on to the next demo. So I mentioned things like aggregating data. Here's a great example of it. So I've got a tab here called tasks, and in there I'm using that Data View Plus app again, but I'm using the aggregator capability, the list aggregator capability. And what I'm doing there is I'm displaying tasks, and I'm actually displaying them from multiple lists. And I'll quickly show you that. So here you see that I'm using the list aggregator, and then you'll see that I've got various aggregation sources defined. So it's going and looking at my site, and it's looking at any lists which are tasks. And we can actually see in my lists I've got both project tasks and I've got business tasks. So it's aggregating those into my app. And we can see that very neatly here where we've got aggregated items. So I've got my task Z, which is from this list, and I think I've got task A here, which is from the other list. So I'm pulling and consolidating that data together. I'm then using the tabbed control to break my data out across multiple tabs. And finally, I'm using the conditional formatting control to apply that red row if any of the items are overdue and they're not completed. So let me just briefly show you the settings applied there. So you can see here that I've got the tabbed control, and it tells me what it's grouping by. So in this case, status. So all I've done is gone and added that control. And then I'm also using my conditional formatting, and you can see here it's got two conditions against it. It's looking at if the due date is less than or after today, and status is not equal to completed, because I'm not worried about overdue items which are done. So another neat aspect of customizing and presenting data in different ways. Finally, I want to point out the fact that you do have the ability to work with custom controls. QuizCon makes several of these controls available by default. So this is the risk control. Again, this is connecting to SharePoint data and presenting items. So each of these are items, but it's just presenting these on my matrix control. So there are several controls which QuizCon make available. Or if you've got your own development resource, or you can work with QuizCon to develop other custom controls. If you need to display certain elements of data in a certain format, then you can do that as well. Okay, so that's working with list data. Let's move on and let's have a little look at forms. So I'm going to switch to another team here. And I wanted to show the fact that we can add these forms to just a regular SharePoint list. So you don't have to have done all that customization with data views or any of the other apps. We can work with a regular SharePoint list if you just need a form. So I've got an employees list here. It's where I manage a list of employees, and I want to manage certain bits of information about those employees. Yeah. Well, actually, I've actually customized the form experience. So if I come in here and click new item, I'm presented with a fairly rich form experience. And the great thing about Conforms is that data is not leaving your tenant, it's building on top of SharePoint, it's leveraging that SPFX capability which Microsoft make available. So you're not running a separate service or a separate app or anything else like that. And so in here, I can come and fill in the employee name. I can select a department. I can enter employee number. I can also come in here and select an office. And dependent on the office I select, I'll actually see different options in this location field. So I've got cascading field options. Notice my tab control. So as well as laying out my form, I've broken out my form across multiple tabs. It's much easier to navigate it, especially sometimes in Teams where you've got a little bit less real estate to use. Because you've got that left-hand navigation, you're often working with slightly less screens. So actually breaking out across tabs is a nice and easy way for users to fill it in. QuizCon also offer a wizard-like mode for forms where it will take you through those tabs one after another, so a bit like filling out a survey. Now here I'm showing you the idea of adding in a repeating table. So in this case, I'm recording assets which users have. So I can come in and I can fill in assets which they've been assigned, and I can set values for those. So very easy, very simple, filling in different fields of information and populating my forms. Even doing things like calculations. So I've got 2 assets here of iPads and it's calculating them up. So very useful for doing things like quotes or expenses where we're entering multiple lines of information against that. We can also show and hide tabs or fields based on other things happening. So I've got a really simple example of that here where I'm clicking the ability of that field saying store documents, and that shows another tab. And this is just to highlight that you can also manage multiple documents against a form. So for instance, you can come in and say, well, here are all of the employees' documents, or maybe you've got a case and you've got a number of files to associate to that case. And the advantage of this model to maybe say something like attachment is you can then also add additional metadata to each of those documents which you associate to the record. Now, how does some of that work? Well, actually, we can work and configure this easily. So I'm just going to come in and I'm going to start to configure my form. And there's a series of different apps available to us. So one of those is the form layout. So in here, we can design the fields which we want to include on my form. So I can easily come and say on a specific tab, what field do I want to add to my form? I can even add elements like just text headers and horizontal lines to improve that format. And I can come in and add and define my different tabs. Notice I've got my conditions here as well, saying when specific tabs should be shown. I can also manage my repeating rows, so those child-like columns, header, footer, perhaps is a better way to describe it. So I can come in here, for instance, and define my assets. When I'm doing that, I'm actually connecting to another list. So I'm storing my child items in another list within my SharePoint site. So I've actually got a list here called assets. And I come in and define what columns I want. What else can I do? I can come in here and I can look at cascading lookup columns. So if I want to add columns which link together, I can do that as well. So let's see another example of that in action. I've got a list here called countries, and my offices list has country as a lookup. So actually I want to introduce country so that people select it, and then based on the country, that will then filter the list of offices. That's really easy to do. So I'm going to come in and I'm going to create a new column and I'm going to call it country. Yeah, I select the list I want to look at. What's my target column? I can even filter items based on a view. So for instance, if I had like the concept of active or countries we work in and countries we no longer work in, I could exclude the ones which are inactive, for example. I'm now going to go and change one of my existing columns. So I'm going to go and look at my office column. And I'm going to say, I'm actually going to filter that column. So I'm going to filter based on country, and I'm going to filter then again based on the country field. So I'm going to say, well, actually, I only want the country field to display. So I only want to display the office when a specific country is selected. Now, finally, I need to go and add this column to my list and to my form. So I'm going to go and add it here, and I'm going to go and add my country field. And I can adjust the layout of this as well. So if I wanted to add an additional column, I can do that. I can resize certain columns if I want to. So it's very easy to work with that layout. So let's go and look at how that's changed my form. You see now I've got a country, so if I go and say UK, it will only present me with London as an available option. So that's how we can work with KWIZ Conforms to build rich forms directly inside of Teams, which is very easy for me to work with and provide users with a richer experience for populating list data. Let's look at a couple of other quickly elements of displaying data in different ways. So one of those is calendars. I mentioned that we find calendars quite hard to display data inside of Teams. To the best of my knowledge, there's not many apps out there which let you display a calendar. And the Calendar Plus app, I think, is excellent at doing this. So we're displaying a calendar. It looks like it's native to Teams. I can quickly switch between week, day interface. I've got the ability to filter and search. So I could say, oh, I actually want to look at a specific day. I can go in and click on a specific calendar item to see more information. And this is configurable because it's built on the DataView Plus app. I can go in and I can go and set my data source like before. I can also go in and configure different apps. So I can go and define the filter. I can go and define settings around my calendar. So there's a number of default options setting what my starting view is and things like that. And I can switch to the advanced view to make further changes to it. Let's show an example of actually configuring this app. So again, adding the DataView Plus app. Again, I configure the data source. In this case, I'm going to say I'm using Calendar Plus. And I'm going to add my calendar. So I'm going to pull through my calendar from Exchange. So in this case, I'm going to use the Graph API. Now this screen may look a bit daunting, but don't worry, QuizCom make a number of default examples available to you. So my calendar, connecting to a shared calendar, or even connecting to a group calendar. Again, that's something people really want to use. I know often the group calendar associated with a team is hidden, but some organizations I've worked with are really keen to make that available. Super easy to do with the Calendar Plus app. So I'm going to do that. And that's pretty much it. There's some options here around mappings, but you don't need to worry about it. It's pre-configured and ready to go. So there you go. That's pulling in my calendar just to prove it. Same items, yeah? Very, very quick and easy. I can also go and start to customize that app again. So let's switch to advanced view. Let's go and add a conditional format, yeah? Really, really quick and easy to do. Add that in. What do I want to do in terms of conditional formatting? Do I want to set an icon, text color, background color? Let's set a background color of red and then add a condition. So I'm going to say if the subject contains workshop. Nope, I haven't got anything which contains workshop. How about meeting instead? Should have checked that one, shouldn't I? There we go. Let's say meeting, yeah? There you go. So it's then highlighting that specific item in red to indicate based on my conditional formatting. So really, really quick and easy to customize those. Okay, that's our calendar. Let's have a look at one last thing I did promise to show you, which was the org chart. Okay, so similar idea, we're pulling data in that could come from lists, it could come from Excel files, it can also come from the Graph API with predefined data sources to connect to. We're displaying that organizational chart. We've got the ability to expand and collapse certain sections of the org chart. We can click on a specific person to pull up their profile card to see all different contact options for them. We can do things like display how many people are below in a tree. Obviously, we can add that Lego controls to do things like filters, even conditional formatting, display things like assistants as well. Again, this is very easy to configure, so we can connect to various data sources. Again, I'm using Graph AD data source. We can come in and configure different settings. We've got a range of different org charts which QuizCom have pre-built, so we can easily switch between different styles if we want to. And each of those styles as well has various formatting options associated with it. So we can go in and look at different layouts for those, different colors and formats for individual fields, as well as various controls around how many levels to open by default. So maybe we want multiple levels opened in our org chart, or even options around, do we want employee count or zoom controls, export controls, many other options. Also, that organizational data can be presented in a table view if you just want a directory interface inside of Teams. So that brings me to the end of my demos. So I'm just going to wrap up with one final slide, and then we'll open it up to questions, which I'm sure we've had a few during the course of the webinar. Actually, before I get to that summary, I wanted to point out how easy these apps are to install. So you can install these apps directly off the QuizCom site. It's a wizard-based process to do that, so really quick and easy to install them. And just in summary, a few key points. Just want to re-emphasize the fact that these are designed for non-technical business users. I hope I've shown you during the course of these quick demos that these are very quick and easy to configure. We can configure them in minutes. I haven't had to do lots of coding or customization. I haven't had to go and build it in Power Apps and then work out how to deploy it or something else like that. Very quick and easy. We focus primarily on Teams. I've dipped into SharePoint a couple of times. We can see all of and work with these things in exactly the same way within SharePoint, or you can use a mixture of both. I think it does solve some of the key data display challenges in Teams. We can easily display information in lots of different ways, in richer ways than perhaps you can do natively, as well as aggregating data from multiple different sources, either lists or leveraging things like search and the Graph API. And I demonstrated very quickly how we can build custom forms quickly, including things like interdependent lookups, those cascading lookups, multiple repeating rows of child items and documents, and showed you how we can lay out our forms and introduce conditional logic into those forms. And with that, I'd say thank you very much for listening to me for about half an hour. And I'll go back to Sarah now for any questions which we might have.